Hey everybody, my name is Mike Horowitz. I am the faculty director here at Perry Worldhouse. You all have heard from me several times throughout the year, including, I think, in September, when I talked about how I'd returned from a couple of years in the Pentagon, and super delighted today to have here to talk about her awesome book, The Inheritance, a person I will just call my boss. In that, we have Dr. Mara Carlin with us today. Dr. Carlin is a distinguished visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. She's a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, and was my boss in the Pentagon. In that, so what you really want to know is, like, what is Professor Horowitz like when you tell him what to do? She is certainly the person to ask, and we're really excited to have her here today. This book is awesome. I know we distributed a bunch of copies of it, and why don't we just jump right in by saying, like, what is this book about, and why did you write it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It is such a treat to be here. Thank you so much for having me, and anyone who does want stories of Professor Horowitz and managing him in the Pentagon, stay after, and I'll give you some of those. It was actually a delight. He is brilliant and thoughtful and collaborative, and brought all of that energy to some of the most important issues around these days in national security. So I wrote this book, The Inheritance, America's Military After 2 Decades of War. And it looks at the legacies of the post-9/11 wars. You know, Mike, you asked me, why did I write this book? And I wrote it because I found that I kept sitting in the Pentagon having conversations about one topic when there was actually this mountain of neuralgia and we were talking about something else. So I would think that I was sitting in a meeting discussing issues like how big should the U.S. Army be as we're building the defense strategy? And then folks would actually start talking about things that had happened in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I realized there's something going on here. There is an inheritance, probably a lot of inheritances, because the U.S. military has been at war for the longest period of time in its contemporary history. So what's come out of that? So I wanted to figure that out, and in particular, I wanted to figure out from the military's perspective. What did it think was coming out of these wars? What are the legacies of these wars for the U.S. military? And so I conducted tons of interviews, about 100 interviews with very senior military leaders or just retired senior military leaders, so I could tell the story from their perspective, hear the themes, and pick up the patterns. And I wanted to figure out, how did they understand their role? How did they understand their relationship to the American public? And how did they understand their relationship to the senior civilian leaders, like the Secretary of Defense, or how we think of the civilian managers of violence? And frankly, what I came up with was not what I had expected, which is usually what happens with research. What I came up with was a number of civil-military relations crises. A crisis of confidence in terms of how the military sees itself, a crisis of caring in terms of how the military sees its relationship with the American public, and a crisis of meaningful civilian control, which is how the military saw its relationship with those folks who had to decide the hardest issues of war and peace. So that's just a teaser, and I can get a little bit deeper into each of those if that's helpful.
So let's talk a little bit about civil-military relations in this context. Like, I see some of the folks from the class I teach on war and strategy, and one of the persistent themes that comes up in American history, if you think about sort of Lincoln and his generals, or sort of Truman firing MacArthur, there's always this sort of civil-military tension that has animated the interaction between the White House, between civilian leaders, and those in uniform. So how did that play out
Absolutely. And look, tension's not a bad thing. In fact, I would suggest tension on these kinds of issues of war and peace is actually a pretty good thing. It's a healthy thing. It depends on how you manifest that tension, right? Are you working in a collaborative and transparent and thoughtful manner? Do you have capable people in uniform and out of uniform who are really willing to wrestle with questions like, hey, how's that war going? Are we achieving our objectives?
How's that war going? Hey, how's the war going, guys? Not sure.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting along those lines. One of the things that I find a little bit astonishing when you look at the post 9/11 wars is there's not a lack of assessment. So the U.S. military assesses the role in assesses the war in Afghanistan over and over and over. And just about every time the U.S. military comes up with the same answer. A little bit more money, a couple more troops, a little bit more time, we're turning a corner. And as you watch that war end, in August 2021, as you watch Afghanistan's government just crumble a whole lot faster than anyone had predicted, I think it really makes you question, gosh, great that we were doing assessment after assessment, why did they keep coming up with the same conclusion? A conclusion that perhaps was not actually delivering.
So does that contribute in some ways to the crisis of confidence then?
It absolutely does. So the crisis of confidence really came through loudly in terms of how the senior military leadership was seeing its role and was seeing the role of the military. Effectively, you have an organization, an institution designed to achieve victory, right? A military uses force to achieve victory, and that wasn't happening. It wasn't happening for a wide number of reasons. And folks offered thoughts. Sometimes it's bad strategy, sometimes it's not enough resources. But what they had to do is then come up with an ersatz victory. Right? You have to have some sort of way to say, this makes sense, this is working. And so what I found is these senior leaders did come up with ersatz victories. Effectively, it said, don't die and protect your folks. And that became what victory looked like, even for the most senior people. You know, fundamentally, when you look at militaries that spend decades fighting terrorists or insurgents, you see this challenge, right? These are not terribly satisfying wars, right? They take many, many decades, but it is ultimately corrosive to this institution when it can't figure out why it's doing what it's doing. So I would hear all sorts of quotes like, gosh, after years and years of being in a war, I sure would like to win something. Or folks saying, it feels like we're just pouring water into a big desert. And so there was this crisis of confidence, and I think we can question the extent to which it still exists, where folks felt like they kept going back to the same places, right? Going on deployment after deployment to Afghanistan or Iraq, often to the exact same province, and not actually feeling like the objectives were being achieved.
So it's like Groundhog Day, but you're like going as like a lieutenant and then maybe as a major, and then you like keep going back and seeing some of the same things.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's so fascinating when you're at war for 2 decades, right? You have more than a generation that is going back as individuals, that's going back even with, say, their children, fighting these wars, and it just continues. You know, there's, I don't know if you all have ever read Duffel Blog, but Duffel Blog is this really fun, satirical...
That's super niche, but...
It is, and it's worth looking up. I'll tell you, it sounds super niche, but actually we've had satire always in warfare. Right, back in the World Wars, we had something called the Wipers Times, which was the same sort of effort to sort of josh at what was happening in war. Frankly, these issues are so painful that folks do need to find a way to lighten them up. So Duffel Blog was a really neat source for me to look at. I was doing looking at a bunch of survey data, I was doing all these interviews, and then I wanted to figure out sort of satirically how were folks telling the stories of these wars. And there was one Duffel Blog piece that really stuck with me, and it said, the war in Afghanistan turns 16 and it gets its driver's license. Right? It was really sort of anthropomorphizing this conflict, and this conflict that just kept on going, that frankly, for the American public, was just ambient noise.
So let's make this about you. In that so one of the things, you know, when I worked for Mara in the Pentagon, one of the incredible things, and this riffs off of something that you said earlier, was you'd be in these meetings, and these were not generally meetings about the Forever War, obviously, but it'd be about China or Russia or something, the future of the military, sort of something like that. And from my perspective, you would think that you were having a conversation about like what kind of cruise missiles the Air Force should buy in the future. And really what you were having a conversation about were three people's relationships with each other when they were all in the Iraq desk in the Pentagon in 2004. So, you in some ways grew up in the Pentagon professionally. So in the context of your book, in some ways, like how did that affect you, and how do you think that affected all of those civilians?
Absolutely. So I first started in the Pentagon in 2004, and I worked in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration. And I worked on a lot of issues at a minimum adjacent to these wars, right? Dealing with, say, like regional security in the Middle East, for example, or defense strategy. And
do you want to talk about Lebanon?
I always want to talk about Lebanon, but it's hard to see how it's terribly relevant. But if folks ever want to, let me know. So I grew up touching a lot of these things and sitting next to the folks who are living and breathing the decisions being made on these wars. And what's interesting when we're in the throes of a conflict is it's pretty rare that the big question is, are we achieving our objectives, right? That happens every now and then. But day to day, it's effectively, hey, are we doing this little thing? Have we done this little thing? And then you try to sort of cumulatively say, all right, what does that add up to? And what does that look like? And you've got to find an incentive. Usually a new administration becomes that incentive to try to step back. So I grew up with a lot of this. I grew up in a time where the Department of Defense just kept getting more and more resources. Often when we think about what it looks like to pay for wars, and we look at the post 9/11 wars, one of my favorite quotes from the book is someone said, it was like an open bar, right? The money was just being thrown left and right. And so the U.S. military was able to build these massive bases in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. It had the money, it had the troops to make that a reality. And so I grew up kind of in that period of wealth, if you will, and also seeing these as the most important issues. And so now, when we look at a security environment where actually we've seen the return of state competitors, where if you ask what the biggest threat is to the United States, I would very much say it is China and not terrorists or proxies, even though they sure cause some serious perturbations. You've got folks who are used to looking at a very different set of problems, trying to figure out how to translate that. A great quote that I had gotten from one senior military leader is he said, gosh, the folks who fought in these wars, they're imprinted with the wrong way of warfare. There's a lot in that if you think about it. First of all, it assumes we know what the right way of war looks like in terms of getting the future right. It also assumes that there's actually nothing that translates from these 20 years of war to dealing with future conflicts. And I think I would fundamentally disagree with that.
All right, so let's talk about people. One of the incredible things about this book is how many senior leaders both current and former, you're able to interview, and given that the focus here is sort of civil military crises, but tell us a good news story first. What's an example of maybe of an incident where things go well or the system works, and then maybe one where it didn't go so well.
Absolutely. So I can give you two good news stories. There hasn't been a massive, spectacular terrorist attack on the U.S. homeland since 9/11. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, I was in Washington on September 11th. I remember what the oxygen felt like there and how every day after, folks were just waiting. And it was almost like every day after, folks worried was September 10th, right? And I actually was just reading about how in the 2 years following the 9/11 attacks, the intelligence community was pulling up something like 400 threats per month. Right? But there hasn't been that effect. That means something in terms of victory. I'll give you another example. The U.S. military, through these 2 decades of war, has honed the ability to find, fix, and finish just about any target anywhere in the world. That means you can imagine almost any discrete challenge anywhere in the world, and the U.S. military has spent 2 decades practicing going after it. That's also pretty incredible. So I think I would kind of put those in your good news bucket in particular. When I think about what hasn't gone so hot, I would actually look at the military's relationship with the U.S. public. And to talk about that, it helps to just spend a minute on who serves in the military. 0.5% of Americans serve in the U.S. military today. And about 80% of those folks have a family member who served. So you've kind of got like the sole source supplier. Add to that a whole bunch of military bases were consolidated across the United States over the last few decades, and you have a situation where it's pretty easy to grow up in America and have never really interacted with someone in the military. So, when I was looking at this piece of it, the relationship of those who serve and whom they serve, what I found particularly worrisome was, frankly, how both of those entities were viewing each other, right? So the American public, we all know, wasn't really asked to do anything after the 9/11 attacks, right? In the 2 decades of war, we weren't asked to pay more taxes, we weren't asked to really make any more sacrifices, anything like that. And there's a lot of research that shows most of the American public has no idea how to start a conversation with those who serve. Then you talk to those who serve, and you do some of the interviews that I engaged in. And what I found was this really surprising pattern. In interview after interview after interview, folks would say the great thing about how the American public is dealing with these issues today of war and peace is they are not mixing the war up with the warrior like in Vietnam. Effectively, what they're saying is, whatever the American public thinks about wars in Afghanistan or Iraq, they're still looking at those who serve in a positive light. By the way, the Vietnam War came up almost as many times in these interviews as the war in Afghanistan, which is a little bit mind-boggling. I wasn't asking anyone about Vietnam. I wasn't interested. So it kept coming up. So first, I would find someone would make this comparison. They'd say, the American public has been really supportive of us. And that's true. By the way, that's changing, which I'll get to in a moment. But the American public has been really supportive of us. And then folks would start to express frustration, bitterness, even anger. And they'd say, thanks for your service. Yeah, that just means thanks for not letting me have to think about these issues. Other folks said, we've got a warrior class and we've got everyone else. And there are surveys showing that high percentages of those who served are not only frustrated that the American public hasn't served, but have also said their views shouldn't matter then on these issues of war and peace. And you might say, well, look, the American public has generally had really high support for the U.S. military, so this maybe isn't great, but maybe it's not that problematic. Unfortunately, that's actually changing. And in fact, public support for the U.S. military has dropped 20% in just the last few years. So fundamentally, this is actually probably really corrosive to American democracy as well, that we see at a minimum this lack of understanding and knowledge of one another, and at a maximum, some real resentment as well from one side.
Well, that's encouraging. So this book came out in late 2021 when you were already in the Biden administration and had already started serving our country again in the Defense Department. And so, tell us a little bit then maybe about your experiences having just written the book and then thinking about, in some ways, how to apply the lessons from it in the context of your sort of next act of public service and maybe how that played out in the Biden years.
Yeah, absolutely. In rather inconvenient timing, I finished the book the day before joining the Biden administration at the very beginning. And of course,
like a deadline to incentivize you, though.
It is spot on, though. There's nothing like a deadline, right? My students just had big papers due at midnight, and I'm pretty sure 90% were turned in at 11:59. So deadlines can be inspiring and motivating. But then the book didn't actually publish for about a year or so. And then I was in this really funny position where I couldn't speak about it for years because I was in a position confirmed by the U.S. Senate and the government. So instead, I kind of just watched the issues and wondered, what impact the book was having.
Do you remember conflict of interest rules?
Big fan of conflict of interest rules and following all sorts of ethics rules as well. So a couple things that I found informative. during this period of time, when I finished this book, the U.S. military is still in Afghanistan, right? I don't know that President Biden, after a really intense review, is going to decide to pull the U.S. military from Afghanistan. And having experienced that and following it, I actually found it validated many of the things that I put in the book, and it opened up a space for conversation. So I had mentioned to you all this crisis of confidence.
So hold on, I'm going to interrupt you to say, like, this is in some ways I'm now going to make light of the very important thing you just said. Like, this is like so huge when you're an author, though, if you then go have a real world experience that validates the research that you did, as opposed to one of our colleagues who will remain nameless, who walked into the Defense Department and 2 weeks later said, oh my God, everything in my first book was wrong.
An unnamed colleague.
Unnamed colleague.
So, when you're writing a book, it's a little bit of a terrifying, soul-searching experience. You want to, especially when it's on these issues of war and peace, you really want to get the story right. And I struggled so much with this issue of the crisis of confidence. Could I really say that senior military leaders couldn't define victory and therefore were struggling with this crisis of confidence? But I kept looking at the words they were saying. I kept looking at the patterns and the themes and said, gosh, it directs me this way. But I twisted and turned over it. And then, as the U.S. pulls out of Afghanistan, I find that suddenly folks are having these exact conversations. Perhaps because the chalk line had been drawn and they had seen a conclusion to this conflict, folks were suddenly very willing and able to say all of these things that they had said to me in these one-on-one interviews. And so that was pretty positive to know that I had gotten that piece of the story right. Another way in which this informed my work is part of my last job, working closely with Mike, was designing the National Defense Strategy, which effectively says, how do you want to spend $850 billion based on your predictions of the future and what's going to happen? It's kind of an exciting endeavor. And this book really helped solidify for me that the U.S. military had learned a whole bunch of interesting operational lessons from fighting in the post 9/11 wars, but we really had to find a way to focus on the threat posed by China. And if you read that National Defense Strategy, and I encourage you all to do so, you can just Google it, it's unclassified, you will find that it is pretty punchy and pithy, and it very much prioritizes the focus on China. So a couple of ways in which I think this really informed my thinking.
So we talk about that a little bit, just in that so then, you're in the Biden administration and you have a whole bunch of senior civilian leaders, sort of yourself included, who in some ways cut their teeth learning about and thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan in the Middle East. And then a whole bunch of military leaders who also have spent, given the 20-year-long war, most of their careers in some ways focus in one way or another on issues surrounding Iraq and Afghanistan in the Middle East. And then the Biden administration, you lead the writing of a national defense strategy focused on China. So was there any like tension there? Like, how did that work? Like, how did our military and civilian leaders think about taking in some ways like their life experience and like experiences, and then all right, like what applies and what doesn't, as we think about what the future looks like and this focus on the Indo-Pacific? Yeah,
I think it is such an interesting question. So I spent a good chunk of my career as an expert on Middle East security issues.
That's the Lebanon reference.
And and as I've gone further in my career, I've brought in, and widened that aperture a lot. But one thing I have found, which I think can sometimes be a little bit uncomfortable for folks who are regional experts to acknowledge, is that there's something that rhymes when you're looking at security challenges. And so when you've built a real depth on a topic, what you want to try to do in jumping to a new topic is figure out, okay, what rhymes and what doesn't? What do I need to learn? What can I actually build on? And so what I found is that was really relevant here, especially, frankly, when we look at how the character of war has been changing in recent years. So if you look at Russia's war on Ukraine, if you look at the different Middle East wars that are swirling, if you look at challenges to deterrence across the Indo-Pacific, actually I think you see a number of things where whichever region you kind of cut your teeth on actually have some real similarities. So for example, you may say, gosh, war in Europe and war in the Middle East, what in the world would that have in common? Well, one thing it has in common is that the continuum of conflict has collapsed in both cases. What do I mean by that? There's a period of time where folks would look at a war and say, this war involves like terrorists and proxies, right? Think about like low end, right? And then they'd say, no, this is a war that involves like conventional sort of capabilities. Or then they look at a war and say, this is the war that involves like nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities. That's sort of a continuum, if you will. And one of the things we see with the changing character war over the last few years is a little bit like that movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. I see all of that in wars in the Middle East and in the war in Europe, right? Where you've got folks operating operationally, strategically, the specter of nuclear weapons, threats of nuclear weapons in all of these cases. So I think you can actually find some translatability here intellectually. I'll also say, when you've worked wars, you've worked crises, right? And you develop just a bunch of skills that are going to be relevant for turning towards, say, potential crises involving the Indo-Pacific.
So I'm just trying to think of like a non-awkward transition to this. So how are civil military relations doing today? Obviously we've had, sorry, let me ask the more serious version of that question. We've had an administration transition, and we have a new administration, the sort of second term of Trump, that has a different approach in some ways, or seems to have a different approach to how it's thinking about relating to the military than many prior administrations. So maybe the right version of this question is, maybe tell us a little bit about how you, and then as a Senate confirmed appointee, thought about your relationship with the uniformed military, and then how you see that then going in the first few months of the Trump administration.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this book, I talk about this crisis of meaningful civilian control. So effectively, when I'm entering the Pentagon in 2021, I'm very worried about civil-military relations. And as you all know, in the United States, we have the system of civilian oversight. So the military has the responsibility to advise, and the civilians have the responsibility to decide. So the system had really broken down in the first Trump administration. You had a real lack of collaboration, to put it lightly, where the most senior folks were in many ways not even talking through these hard issues and just doing what they wanted. That's not great, right? These are important issues. We've got to have some serious dialogue. We had a situation where the senior military leadership kept talking about best military advice, where effectively they were saying, I've got a narrow, singular answer to any problem you have, and I'm going to put it in writing. Best of luck figuring out what to do. Also, not healthy whatsoever. So the Biden administration...
That's like the nicest thing I've ever heard you say about that phrase. There was like no easier way to trigger Mara in the Pentagon than to just use the phrase "best military advice." Like the steam would start coming out of her like head. So, but tell us like the real reason why. Like why is it that phrase? Because there's actually substance behind your, I think, frustration with that phrase. Can you give us a little more there?
Yeah, absolutely. So effectively, if we're making policy on a hard topic, we're going back and forth. Right? We're trying to figure out, what are the objectives? How do we fulfill those objectives? What are the real options? What are the pros and cons of those options? That is an iterative process. Sometimes it's time-consuming. Sometimes it can feel like a bit of micromanagement, to be sure. But it's a process in which you have a responsibility to actively participate. And so what would happen is, if you come in and say, this is my best, period, and now I'm done, you've taken yourself out of the game.
Pens down, we're done.
Right, this is the answer. You've also really boxed folks in, right? Because if this is the answer, and maybe that answer can't be executed because of resources, because of politics, because it turns out it's a fantasyland, answer that's never going to get executed.
Like it's a terrible idea.
Right. There's many different reasons in which that answer might not be doable or a smart call. But if you've just said, this is the answer, I'm done, that dialogue stops. Right? That's really problematic. The military has the responsibility to advise. Right? The civilians have the responsibility to decide. You've now just stopped that process. And I'm really delighted to say that the last two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually stopped using that term and asked their staffs to stop using that term. Because at a minimum, they realized that it triggers civilian ears in a problematic way. At a maximum, they hopefully realized all of those pieces that I just highlighted. So what I saw was a real kind of rebaselining, if you will, to healthy civil-military relations under Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mark Milley and General C.Q. Brown. Effectively, a lot more collaboration, a lot more transparency, a lot more efforts to really dig into these tough issues. Oftentimes issues in which your options are like 51%, 49%, and you're choosing between kind of awful, terrible, and catastrophic. Where are we now? Bottom line, we're in a pretty tough moment. And I think that pretty tough moment became quite loud just a few weeks ago. You all might remember on a Friday night, there was a bureaucratic massacre at the Department of Defense. A bunch of senior military leaders were fired. Now look, senior military leaders get fired, I don't want to say all the time, but relatively regularly. Shouldn't be terribly interesting. Why do I say that this is historic and anomalous? Because of two reasons. One, the first set of folks who get fired, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, head of the Navy, the number 2 in the Air Force, no reason is given for their firing. They're not fired for cause. It's not, you spoke inappropriately to the media, you lost this battle.
You crashed a ship.
You crashed a ship, you accidentally sent nuclear weapons parts to Taiwan. All things that I've seen happen, right?
You're like, who hasn't?
So it wasn't that. It was just said, thank you so much for your service, and you're fired. And after a lot of digging, it seems as though it may have been related to issues regarding diversity and equity. So that's all a little bit curious. So those folks are fired. That's unfortunate. I would actually suggest the mix set of firings that were announced that night was even more problematic. These are the senior military lawyers. Right, the folks whose job it is to tell you the thing that is the most important if you are in uniform, which is that's legal or that is illegal. You know, the only sort of order that someone in uniform is supposed to say no to is an illegal order. It may be unethical and immoral, and you can choose to refuse those orders, but there's going to be some major consequences. You may go to jail, etc. But you're supposed to refuse an illegal order. And with these firings, effectively what happened, so over the coming days, the Secretary of Defense said that he really didn't want folks boxed in. He made a number of statements that made it seem as though he didn't want legal issues to be terribly relevant anymore. And that is ultimately profoundly unhealthy for the U.S. military. So where are we now? We're in a little bit of a tough position, to be honest. It's a pretty historic position. If you find this topic interesting, I would say watch this space, because on April 1st, you're actually going to see the confirmation hearing for the potential new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, unlike all of his recent predecessors, doesn't actually have the background or experience that is usually required for this role. He's got a ton of really fantastic experience, but not the actual positions that one would, legally need to have filled to be able to take on this role. So you can watch there to see what's going on. If you followed perhaps the news of the last few days about the Signal chat, there are many striking things about folks speaking about highly
pun intended on striking things?
Indeed it is. You saw folks talking about very classified information involving like troop movements on an unclassified system. What's also interesting is it does not appear that anyone from the U.S. military is on those chats. So I think all of this is telling me that we're in a bit of a curious time on this front.
All right, last question for you. This will be a quick one, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So please think about what you might want to ask Dr. Carlin. Is there anything you wish you had written in the book that you didn't write, and that like, if you not just like carrying it forward, but is there anything now like having in some ways like lived some of the experiences that you wrote about at a much more senior level in the government? Is there anything you wish you would have said that you didn't?
That's a really fun question. So the book talks about these crises.
Now she's mad at me.
No, it is a fun question. I like it. There's no one who knows the flaws in their book more than the author, obviously. The book tries to look at these civil-military relations crises. It tries to look at how we thought about paying for war and perceiving war and theories of war. When are we more likely to succeed or not? There were periods of time where folks said, hey, it's all about counterinsurgency, and there were other times where folks said, that actually doesn't make any sense, or we can't seem to figure out whole of government, for example. One of the saddest quotes I got was someone who said, whole of government, right, the idea that we should all work together, development and diplomats, etc. They said what it really should be is HOLE of government, the whole of government. And then they said it's really all about the Department of Defense. And that was pretty sad. But sitting on that point in particular, what I would have liked to do, fast forwarding, is we now actually have a really interesting example where the U.S. government has found a way to bring all of its tools of statecraft together to deal with an adversary in war. And the example here is the response to Russia's war on Ukraine. So throughout the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, it was really hard to get enough diplomats, enough development experts in a timely manner to have the resources that they want, right? They get like 1/1,000,000th the resources of the Department of Defense, and to be able to kind of knit together that whole of government, thoughtful approach to dealing with these conflicts. And what's kind of amazing about the response, especially in that first year to Russia's war in Ukraine, is you saw all of that actually spin together pretty masterfully. The diplomats engaging in their work, you saw the Treasury folks putting sanctions on, you saw the folks in uniform being able to do things like rapidly equip Ukraine's military and to pressure the Russian military. So it's a case study that wouldn't have happened, but I'm really quite heartened to know it turns out it's possible. And what I've been thinking a lot about is, so why did it work that time and it didn't work in the war that actually was our war, in the post-9/11 wars?
Oh, that's very thought-provoking. All right, we're talking about Mara's great book, The Inheritance, and now want to open it up to see what kind of questions people have. You can.
So recently in Germany there has been a crisis of they want to build an army and Gen Z not wanting to roll into the army. Is it possible that the United States, with the inheritance of the Afghan war and the current DoD situation, like cuttings and everything, could it be that the United States Gen Z kids do not want to roll into war? Could it be possible that there is a draft riot situation, a modern version of it? Would it trickle down to Generation Alpha? How is the government seeing this situation with Gen Z and Alpha?
Yeah, it's a really good question when we look at this idea of propensity to serve. And what I found, and what a lot of survey data finds, is there's a pretty high propensity to serve. Folks want to be public servants, but they often don't know what the opportunities are or how to realize them. And in fact, there was a great commission a couple years ago that pushed this idea of requiring national public service. So it doesn't mean you have to go serve in a military per se, but requiring that national public service for a year or so. I personally think this is a tremendous idea. When you look just at the institution of a military, it brings folks together from different backgrounds, right? They develop a sense of nationalism and pride. They also developed a whole bunch of really useful skills as well. Interestingly, in Germany is a really fascinating case study right here, as you highlight, because Germany's military had conscription, right, where you have to go serve in the military. It doesn't anymore, and now it started this thing called voluntary conscription, which is maybe, the best contradiction in 2 words you could ever imagine.
Right, like, how is that, it just like doesn't make sense.
This is what it is called, and the idea of how they've kind of executed voluntary conscription is when you sort of hit the age of 18, you're getting these very encouraging letters. Hey, this is an opportunity. Would you like to learn more about it? Perhaps you should do so. And I think that that's probably a smart first step. The challenge we find in military, in sort of the literature on these topics of military effectiveness, is that when you require people to join your military and you don't face an existential threat, you're almost always a much less effective military. And so there's this really interesting trade-off when you think about it. If you want to sort of build nationalism, if you want to build dialogue, you want to bring folks together, but you also want an effective military. So really wrapping, I think, to the heart of your question, there is a propensity to engage in some type of service. I mean, we see this, frankly, when we just look at like volunteer levels of your generation. It's helping folks understand how to make that a reality and how to do so, not necessarily serving in a military, but also not waiting years and years to go through some sort of clearance process, et cetera.
Both of our dissertation advisors would be so proud of your answer. All right, maybe in the back. No, really. Rosa,
this one's a little out of left field. Given that the youngest Wright brother also was able to see the first man on the moon, and given that 100 years ago we had technology of a musket, and now we a couple of weeks ago had a robotic attack in Ukraine. How do you feel that the technology of warfare is changing, and are we really prepared for that?
So I'm going to answer this question, but I'm also going to ask Mike, because he's like pretty much one of the top experts on this topic. Are we prepared? Definitely not. That shouldn't worry you as much as it might, which is we're never prepared for changes in technology. The example that is so loud in my brain is when the railroad, rifle, and telegraph come together. First of all, those are not all seen as military technology, obviously, right? Like the telegraph, for example, the railroad isn't, and yet they end up transforming warfare. We see this from the late 1800s onward. And so often what matters is not necessarily being ready and being kind of ahead of the game, but it's the ability to recognize that change is happening and to very quickly adapt and innovate. And then the last point I'll make on this before turning to Mike is, in my mind, it still seems as though technology is going to be important, maybe even more important in warfare, but it is fundamentally a human endeavor. You're fundamentally not going to be able to lose those points that, frankly, Karl von Clausewitz told us more than 100 years ago. The fog of war, friction within war. It is fundamentally about human beings, whether they are going to be really widespread on the battlefield or really relevant in the capitals making the decisions.
So I see some chuckles from some of my students who are in the audience that have endured a lot about railroads, rifles, and telegraph, and about Clausewitz this semester, and so
how lucky are all of you?
Certainly, your answer is perfect. The only thing I would add to it is if you look at the history of military innovation adoption and which militaries do well and which militaries do poorly, often there's a difference between who invents technology and who succeeds with it. In that the British invent the aircraft carrier, but it's the US and the Japanese that figure out how to use it. And the British invent the tank, and it's the Germans that figure out blitzkrieg. And so in some ways, to add to Mara's point about uncertainty, there's inevitable uncertainty about like what will be invented and sort of where technology will go, and obviously we shape that to some extent. But the thing we can control in some ways is more like what we do when those inventions happen, and that's where being a leader in adoption is critical if say like you are American and wish the U.S. military to stay ahead.
Yeah, I want to add just one point I'm realizing. So the U.S. military really likes to study others' wars. You see this following the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. The U.S. Army, which has, by the way, just spent a number of years in Vietnam, used 58,000 American troops in Vietnam. The U.S. Army barely studies the Vietnam War, but it spends a lot of time looking at that 1973 Arab-Israeli War, and it actually transforms in line with that. In 2014, Russia invades Crimea. The U.S. Army, again, spends a lot of time studying it and then undergoes a real shift based on it. And so what's particularly relevant, given, you mentioned the war in Ukraine, and we're looking at the post-9/11 wars, is how do you, at a minimum, keep on studying others' wars, but how do you convince folks to also study their own wars and study what comes out of those, and not just perhaps be comforted in the sort of safe space of trying to understand what happens to them and what did they endure, but also what happens to you?
Self-reflection is hard. Over there.
In your strategizing, did you consider mercenary armies like the Wagner Group and how to maybe exploit them? For it always seemed to me that maybe we could buy them, just bribe them since they're fighting for money, just pay them to not fight so well or to fight for someone else. I understand there's treaties against doing that, but obviously it's all over the world. I mean, we've got our own version of it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I didn't look at it for this book. What I would say, and like Wagner, there's a whole lot of studying and fascinating studying to be done on that front, particularly given that the fellow who runs Wagner and turns it into this really effective force decides to kind of overachieve, threaten Putin, and then, gosh, mysteriously his plane just explodes. So
He did like half a coup? Like, he didn't do a full coup, he did like half a coup?
He tried and then seemed to think he was okay, which, the psychology, if only one could have interviewed him. But anyway, I didn't look at that. I do think it is worth looking at these. That said, I don't think it's a smart approach for U.S. policy, and that's because ultimately mercenaries can't really be controlled. They're just going to go to who wants to pay them the highest wage. And if I'm actually thinking about paying the highest wage, why not spend that money getting folks bought into my institution and living and breathing that institution and its values and actually kind of operationalizing them that way?
Thank you. I'm curious about the separation between the warrior and the war that you mentioned earlier. Like, is there anything culturally or structurally about the U.S. that's like enabled that? And do other countries show similar patterns of that separation, or are there places where that is impossible? And I guess how has that evolved, I guess, from Vietnam to where it is today? And this is like the sixth question. How does that change with technology? Is there also the separation between the tech and the war?
Yeah, so many good questions in that. So what we see in the Vietnam War is a number of Americans who do not support the war and are very loud about that, and then also do not support those who serve. By the way, many of those who serve are drafted, right? The U.S. doesn't have an all-volunteer force. And in fact, when you talk to Vietnam veterans, you'll often hear stories of, I walked from the train station to the taxi in my uniform and people were attacking me or spitting at me or swearing at me. I mean, really, really horrible things. What's interesting when you talk to folks who are post-9/11 veterans, you get stories like, I walked around in my uniform and no one even noticed, right? And I think it's just sort of such a stark, example there. So we fast forward to folks not even noticing the post-9/11 wars, right? 2 decades. Think about how often over those 2 decades of war it crossed your mind or your friends' minds or your colleagues' minds that the U.S. had its troops fighting and dying in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, as someone obviously whose profession this is, I mean, it was always amazing to me how limited the media focus was on it, frankly, how limited the congressional focus was as well, how few hearings there were too. And I think what we saw from the public is this broad but hollow support, where folks oftentimes didn't have interactions with folks in the military, and when they did, they just didn't know where to start conversations. So I think then you're really asking, like, do we see this elsewhere, and then what to do about it? So the United States is kind of an interesting case study because we're a massive country, right, like 350 million or so folks, and we have an all-volunteer force, and it's worked pretty well. I mean, we've gotten pretty capable folks since this all-volunteer force was started in the 1970s, and so we haven't really needed to do anything to change this, right? As long as folks were getting what they needed, we haven't had to make such changes. So what does technology do? And there are some, and Mike, I suspect, has many stories of this, there are some in uniform who are really nervous that technology will ultimately mean you have a much, much smaller military. And if you think about it, that could actually exacerbate many of the tensions I just highlighted. What I think about, though, is that given the shifts in technology, we actually need some different types of folks in our military as well, right? We need folks who understand cyber issues. We need folks who understand space issues. We need folks who understand artificial intelligence. I mean, like, the list goes on and on and on. We need folks who are probably going to be increasingly well educated. And so the developments in technology may actually offer an opportunity for us to diversify those who serve and deal with this gap between those who serve and those whom they serve. That would require, though, making it not so difficult for folks to be public servants. It would require really looking at things that encourage unit cohesion. So, say, policies that have been debated and look like they may be implemented by the current Department of Defense, by the current Secretary of Defense, saying things like, hey, if you're transgender, you shouldn't serve. Hey, if this is your experience, you shouldn't serve, et cetera, et cetera. Those kinds of barriers to entry actually could cause some real problems, in fact, if you look at how the future security environment is shifting.
Great pitch for my robot army and the upsides for civil military relations and things. I appreciate it. All right, I think we have time for one more question, or we can do two if they're fast. Maybe here and then there. Why don't you both ask them and then Mark can answer? So
you might have heard, like, the Office of Med Assessment and other programs got shut down, funding to think tanks, and I was wondering, Office of Med Assessment could theoretically be replaced, but this kind of divide between, like, the civil and military establishment, and especially with the Trump administration, what do you think it could have, like, lasting effects on regarding, like, our preparation for conflicts in the future?
All right, that's question one. Question two.
Very nice talk. All your commentary on technology has kind of reminded me of Cartwell's law that military might typically follows technological innovation in countries. And in reference to your comment about being the leaders in adopting technology, how do you foresee the U.S.'s ability to do that as we begin to engage in conflicts with authoritarian governments that engage more in secrecy and espionage around their technological innovations?
Thank you so much. So maybe I'll take them in opposite order. I mean, look, you can steal all the things, and Moscow, Beijing, Tehran are definitely trying to steal all of the things. That's why one would want, say, like, good operational security, for instance, and not text war planning on signal, especially if one of those folks happens to be, like, in Moscow, as this is all happening.
Cool.
Yes, there's some amazing examples where in particular you can compare technological developments by China's military with developments in the U.S. military, and you'll see that a lot of the platforms happen to just serendipitously, no doubt, look really, really similar. Well, it's probably because the plans were stolen, right?
It's so bad. So bad, sorry. Forget.
But it seems to me that is not good, obviously. There's also limits to that, though, right? There are limits, and in fact, what is the comparative advantage when you're in a democratic system compared to an authoritarian system? For the U.S. military is you've got folks who are empowered, who have this notion of mission command, which is, I'm going to give you the broad guidance, and you're going to go figure out the best way to make that a reality. I mean, the great example in my mind, a great contemporary example here, is look at how terribly Russia's war in Ukraine started, and how just really catastrophic that first year or so of the war was. What you saw was, first of all, a lot of folks in uniform not being involved in the planning, so that's not ideal, obviously, for them. Moreover, what you saw is folks who were really nervous to say, hey, boss, this isn't working. Hey, boss, our equipment is really shoddy. Hey, boss, we don't have the training for this. And the impact of that is that Russia has suffered 700,000 casualties in this war over the last few years. Try to wrap your head around that. That's effectively more than the U.S. military has suffered in all of its wars combined. So in just the last few years, it's part of the reason they're trying to get folks like North Korea to send troops, or why they're relying on the Wagner Group, for example. So effectively what I would say is there's a comparative advantage that democratic militaries have when they are fighting authoritarian militaries. That said, the authoritarian militaries can keep on just throwing the people and don't really have to worry about public support and, effectively running out of those folks. So turning to your question, the Office of Net Assessment, it looks like, is being closed down and then re-stood up. This is an office that has existed for a bunch of decades in the Pentagon.
I have so many feelings about this.
No doubt, and we'll stick with the superficial ones. And both of us have worked very closely with that office over the years. Their job is to kind of help you predict the future, and that's a useful endeavor. I think, though, the heart of your question, though, is really looking at what if the civilians make bad decisions, right? And I can give you sort of an answer in the literature, and then I can give you the reality. So the answer in the literature says civilians have the right to be wrong. Right? Remember I said earlier, the military has the responsibility to advise. Civilians have the responsibility to decide. And so because the civilians are in charge, they have the right to be wrong. And there's a bunch of examples we can think of. I mean, not least, the decisions on the post-9/11 wars fundamentally sit squarely at the feet of the civilians, right? Because of the system of civilian control. So the civilians have the right to be wrong. Well, we're in a particularly tough moment here, is we have a Secretary of Defense who is the least qualified person to ever hold this role. And in no way is that a partisan statement. You can look at the biographies of all the folks who've ever held this role. You see some folks who spend a lot of time in Congress, some folks who are really like wonky intellectuals, some folks that have spent their careers inside the government. You can give a bunch of examples, but what you don't have is someone with such limited and superficial experience. And you don't have, frankly, good literature in trying to understand what do you do if those civilians don't have the capabilities, right? So healthy civil-military relations is really assuming that you have folks on both sides that have the capabilities, the competence, and the willingness to really work together to collaborate. But what if the folks who are under our system supposed to make those decisions don't have those capabilities? And frankly, we're kind of living a natural experiment now as we get to see what that looks like.
Well, on that note, Mara Karlin has written an incredible book, The Inheritance. If you want to understand where the U.S. military has been and where it is going, highly recommend, if you did not already get a copy here, purchasing it, and certainly please crack it open and read it. I know we had a lot more questions, including sort of online and in the room, and I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them, but please join me in thanking Mara for joining us today.
Thank you so much.